Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ross. I'm the director of the Graphic Communication Design program here at Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London. Today is April 20th, 2021, and this is the second week of our third term of the academic year. Virus levels have come down in the UK and things are starting to open up in London. I am so excited to be back hosting tonight's event from CSM's building in Granary Square and Windsea. So we are in the GCD studios on the second floor in the F block. And we have been delighted to have most of our students back in the studios with us for some small group in-person teaching over the past few weeks, as well as to have all our workshops up and running. It's really exciting. I want to thank everyone in the program for continuing to look after each other by following the various safety measures we have in place. It's been a tough year, but also inspiring. I'm incredibly proud of how much care has been demonstrated by our community. So this is the sixth and final event in this year's series, GCD's first ever online lecture series titled Depth of Field, which is also our first ever public lecture series. I'd like to once again extend a warm welcome to all of the GCD students in London and those studying remotely from other parts of the world, whether listening live or tuning in later. I think we also have a larger number of guests than usual tonight joining from other universities and from industry. It's great to have you all with us. On our Depth of Field website, which is csmgcd.net/lectures, you'll find an introduction to the series, full playback of all 5 previous events, and some more related links and information for each event. I'd also like to remind everyone that we call this a lecture series, but it isn't actually made up of long lectures. The previous events have each had 2 guests and followed a standard format designed to foreground conversation. As our final event in this series, tonight we will follow a more experimental format, which will include more guests, more discussion and debate, and some special interventions from our partners who I will speak about in a minute. So tonight's event is designed in particular with our about-to-be graduates in mind, who are currently making a big push on their final major projects. We started putting this together after hearing from a lot of students that they are worried that they might be less skilled than previous cohorts because they have been studying in far more constrained and difficult conditions. What we would really like to do this evening is altogether reject this idea and actually completely turn it on its head. The purpose of this event is to directly address those of you about to graduate. You are about to emerge into an extremely challenging environment. However, compared to all of the students, possibly in the history of our subject, in completing your studies during this extreme time, in so many ways, you have become more resourceful, more independent, and self-aware, more prepared for the unknown, more mature, and more questioning. Those of you graduating now have distinct and important skills and experiences that no other previous generation of graduate designers has offered. We are so proud of what we see you achieving every day, and we want to reassure you that you have great reason to feel confident in yourselves as individuals and as designers. So this brings me to one of the other things that makes tonight special. To springboard this event and help get this message out widely to students all over the world, we have teamed up with 2 partners, Design Observer and Thames Hudson. And this is on the occasion of the publication of a new project by Design Observer's founding editor, author, designer, educator, Jessica Helfand, and published by Thames Hudson. So Jessica worked on this book in collaboration with graphic designer, writer, educator, Jarrett Fuller, and the 2 of them have put together a video introducing some of their thinking and approach. So I'll just ask Jacob to play that video for us.
Envy is ignorance. Imitation is suicide. Is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood. And Socrates and Jesus and Luther.
I wrote this book that we designed together on the subject of self-reliance when I was not only away from my teaching duties, because I was in lockdown in Los Angeles, but I was away from my children. And I started to think about children everywhere, and I started to think about students everywhere, and I wanted to write a book for them, inspired by this marvelous essay written by Ralph Waldo Emerson, white male privileged 19th century philosopher whose works are epic, but I think in this particular instance, this essay really resonated with me and with you, I think.
what was it about that essay that you felt was applicable to this moment, despite all of those cultural differences?
I think in a world where consensus is such a strong driving force in industry, in the economy, on creative teams, I thought it's high time we turn to someone for whom consensus was actually evil.
It's funny that we take this essay that's over 100 years old and designed it in such a modern, a modern way. And the typefaces themselves, I think it's important to note, have special meaning in the text and in your history and in our history. So the main book, the Book of Emerson's text, is set in a typeface called Emerson.
Right.
And then your essays and your kind of commentary and responses are set in Neuhaus Unica, which I guess is like the official Design Observer typeface.
Correct. I wrote this book and we designed this book in a year of incredible social tumult, where questions of what is accessible and what is legible, and legibility, not just in terms of typography, but cultural legibility, right?
Yeah.
But I think interpretation of what an American, the resonance of an American individualist voice land differently for European readers. And so being conscious of that, again, at a moment when we're watching the George Floyd world unfurl in unprecedented ways, it makes you think about the choice of a typeface in a way that's completely different. What does access really mean? What does inclusivity really mean? But to come back to the crisis of the individual, I mean, there's no more pertinent essay, I think, than this one to really stop and think about what the world means to you.
There's something very contemporary, very 21st century in the construction of the book itself, in that you can read his entire essay all the way through in the first part of the book, but we broke it up through these big kind of illustrative block quotes, but then also previewed your essays that appear at the end, which you could almost think of as kind of extended footnotes.
The fact that we have the main text in justified type, which most people don't like to do. It feels like a very 19th century thing to do. My essays, which all appear at the end of the book, are all aligned on the baseline, which is like setting something flush right, rag left. But I thought if he was grounded in the column that was a justified type, then my essays could be grounded by being anchored to the bottom of the page. Many moving parts, and yet the logic of it really, I think, became clear to us as we went through, the more we actually isolated these dimensions. And this brings us to the topic of the end papers.
If this is a book of contrasts of old and new, 19th century, 21st century, serif, sans serif, black, white, this is probably the biggest contrast in the entire book. Then visually also, we took the letter I from both typefaces, Emerson and Neuhaus Unica.
So I think it also speaks a little bit to the cover. We went through many drafts of the color. I think this was in some ways a painful process, but a really educational one. This isolation on the cover of the I was something that we wanted to carry into the end papers. Very often, end papers are like the overture to a symphony. It has to say something about the book without giving the book away.
It feels like a modern William Morris, all that ornamentation and nature that would be on his books, around the edges of those like illuminated manuscripts. This is like the 21st century version of that, but instead of flowers and vines, it's loading signs.
Nature was so important to Emerson and the 19th century book design that would have followed him through his prolific years as a published author. And I like that you said William Morris, who of course was a Brit, and this is an American writer. So I think even more we have a dialogue between centuries and between continents.
Okay, so I have this book here. It's quite beautiful, and I'll just read you a quick bit from Thames and Hudson's website. When Emerson published his most famous essay in 1841, it was in the aftermath of the calamitous financial collapse of 1837. His positive vision for the power of individualism and personal responsibility was issued in a climate filled with panic and uncertainty, and at a time much like today, when the values of society and humanity were in the process of being reformed. I'm also excited to announce that Thames Hudson have made it possible to provide these books to all of our final year students. So that's stage 3 students on BA Graphic Communication Design and year 2 students on MA Graphic Communication Design. There's, I think, around 200 of you. So these will be distributed in class over the next few weeks and also mailed out to those students who are not currently attending in person. So we'll get you the details of how that's going to work separately. The choice to revisit and reconsider Emerson through the lens of graphic design, education, and practice in the context of contemporary events has served as a kind of springboard for tonight's discussion, which is titled What's Next? We've invited 3 guests, each offering a different perspective on some of the questions weighing most heavily on the minds of students about to graduate. So as we continue to weather the largest public health crisis in living memory, David Davenport Firth, also known as DDF, will speak to the expanding role for design in the future of healthcare communication. Gemma Copeland will speak about the potential role of designer worker cooperatives in reconfiguring the ways creative practitioners structure their work. And Mike Calandra Achode will bring his perspective on working on projects that cross national and cultural boundaries. So I'm now going to invite Gemma, DDF, and Mike to each talk for a quick 5 minutes to give an introduction to their practices. And from there, we'll jump into a discussion which will draw in questions from the audience on YouTube. As a reminder, if you want to participate in the discussion, you will need to log into YouTube. So that's something that you could do now while people are introducing themselves. So I'm first going to introduce Gemma Copeland, who is joining us from Vilnius, Lithuania. Gemma is a digital designer interested in developing new models for living and working collaboratively. She is a member of the not-for-profit worker cooperative Common Knowledge. They design and build digital technology that supports, amplifies, and extends the work of grassroots organizations and communities. They share a vision of a world where people are confident in their capacity to self-organize and empowered by digital technology. So I'll pass the mic to Gemma for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Rebecca. And yeah, thank you, CSM, for inviting me here. So yeah, I'm Gemma. I trained as a graphic designer back in Australia. And I've been working for like the past decade in Australia and the Netherlands and the UK. Over time, I kind of moved away from graphic design into more digital and interactive design, and kind of everything from interactive exhibitions to like websites and apps. And primarily kind of for cultural institutions and universities and that kind of thing. And yeah, in 2019, I joined Common Knowledge, which, as Rebecca said, is a worker co-op. So there's 5 of us. We're kind of a mix of designers and developers from various backgrounds. And yeah, so we kind of design and build digital tools. And our focus is really on like giving people these tools so that they can build power and organize themselves in response to issues in their own lives and communities. So maybe to talk a bit about what is a worker co-op, because I don't think it's that common an idea, I guess. I certainly didn't know about it until a few years back, and I was like, whoa. So a worker co-op is an organization democratically owned and run by its members. So it just means that like all members are owners rather than kind of having a traditional hierarchical structure where you have like a boss and employees, that kind of thing. Co-ops are also governed by like the cooperative principles, of which there are like 7, and including stuff like autonomy and independence, concern for community, that kind of thing. And yeah, we're a not-for-profit as well, which means that if we make surplus, it kind of either goes towards maintaining our co-op or like subsidizing solidarity work for organizations. And we also have like a completely transparent, like flat pay structure. So everyone gets paid the same no matter like what their experience or profession. I get very nerdy about this kind of like the actual kind of structure of the work, because I think that it's super important. This idea of like, if you want to kind of politically engage practice, it's not just about making like a political poster or something like that, but it's also looking at like the ways, like the way that we work together, basically, and like how we do the work as well as what. And we kind of think if we want to kind of enable radical change, we need to also question it like in our own lives and our own work. And so we see worker co-ops as like a way of prefiguring an alternative future which has solidarity and interdependence at the center. So in terms of the like work we do day to day, so we place like a really strong focus on building relationships, forming like long-term partnerships, and working directly with organizers. And this work usually falls into kind of 3 core activities as we think about it. So there's, of course, the like designing and building part. There's also a fair bit of like training and facilitating, and then also like research and strategy. And with all of these things, we see technology as like a multiplier rather than like a proponent of social change in itself, which is why that like we spend so much time training and facilitating and organizing people in one way or another, because we kind of see our work, at the end of the day, it all comes down to people. And yeah, so the projects we work on always have some element of this kind of self-organization, but from lots of different angles. We work with groups of different like concerns or formats. So like unions or community groups or think tanks, campaigning organizations. So earlier this year, for example, we launched a website for an organization called Just Treatment, which was like a campaign focused on winning, well, it's ongoing, called NHS New Deal. And the focus is on winning more funding and like better support for doctors and nurses and the NHS in general. So the website kind of shares information about the campaign and kind of offers people different ways to get involved from there. We've also done, like recently done work with Cooperation Town, which is like a UK-wide network of food co-ops, just kind of looking at how they could maybe use digital technology to like further decentralize and empower their network. We have also done, we do some kind of research-based projects, which are more about kind of like interviewing people, like mapping a particular area, and making recommendations. And we also do kind of behind the scenes infrastructure, like we did some caseworks. We put together like an open source casework tool for a grassroots trade union. And so, I guess we see like through this work, we try to work with all these kind of different but interconnected organizations, because we think that it's like really important that they're kind of working in relation to each other and supporting each other. And we see our role within this like ecosystem as like being able to hopefully like identify shared struggles and like opportunities to kind of share knowledge, hence the name. And we also look for ways to, for example, like generalize and open source like the software that we make, and kind of build resilient and large scale structures through our work.
Great. Thank you, Gemma. That's really interesting. Okay. It's going to be quite interesting to talk about how that model relates to some of the kind of themes of individuality that are coming up as well, how those models relate to some of the themes of individuality that have been coming up. I'm going to introduce next David Davenport who's also known as DDF. And he's actually our first guest this year who has come into CSM. And he's actually just on the other side of the studio for me, which is delightful. And DDF is a managing partner at Ogilvy, which is an international creative agency. And in particular, he's managing partner of Ogilvy Health's Brain Sciences Center, which focuses in particular on the psychology of health decision-making and health behavior. DDF has been involved in a number of prior collaborations with GCD students, and his enthusiasm for collaborating with graphic designers stems from an interest in health decision-making and how the sort of psychosocial aspects of health and illness can be better managed through information and data visualization, as well as through digital engagement. So I'm going to pass it over to DDF for a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate and also accepting my keenness to actually come back to Granary Square. It's the first time I've left Brighton in over a year, I think. And wow, I was really excited getting on that train. That's bizarre, isn't it? And the other thing I wanted to say right up front, I want to sort of share my perspectives, my experiences, and what I've realized, I would say over the past couple of years in particular, is that the notion that actually we're all individual, and hopefully some of this, what I have to say, what we all have to say, resonates with people, but at the same time, it might not. And I just want to make a point that I'm not here to preach, and I might get overexcited and over-enthused about certain things, but that's just my perspective and where I've come from. A little bit of background in the context of, I suppose, one of the things that you mentioned, that some of people viewing students might be feeling that they're less skilled than previous cohorts and concerns like that. My background's been quite eclectic. I actually started off studying dentistry. I then moved into management studies, and then I moved into psychology, health psychology, and the world in which I currently live. And I've also worked here in the UK and in the US. And so lots of experience, worked with 6 different organizations, and in some of those, many managers, and lots of, as I say, different experiences. I want to start with one thing that really stands out, and that's a project. And the reason I want to share it with you is because it relates to design, and it relates to a big challenge that I wasn't expecting, and it really threw me, actually, that challenge. And I don't want to make anybody involved in the project uncomfortable. So what I'll say, it was when I started working with Ogilvy, which is 20 years ago. I'm quite old. When I started working with Ogilvy, and I started with our packaging and corporate design firm, a great firm. I'm not a designer by training or background, but to be immersed with graphic designers really became something that it was like a great big pot of ice cream, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And we had this project, and my role was from a strategic perspective, and I introduced this concept called visual planning. And the idea was that those of us that sit in front of computers and writing strategy, what went through my mind was, is that the best way to connect with designers' minds to make the transition of what we want to do from a business to actually how do we make a difference, in this instance through packaging design? So we developed this thing called visual planning. And the idea was that we ourselves, the strategists, the graphic designers, and the client would come together, and we would explore the business challenge using visuals. And we would bring visuals together, And we would then tell our stories in different groups, and the groups would be a mixture of graphic designers, strategists, and clients. And invariably, we'd have 3 groups. And we'd been doing this for about a year, and it was going really, really well. And we became more experimental, and our designers were feeling that they had a much richer understanding of what the challenge was. And there was one particular brand. It was a diaper brand or a nappy brand for babies that we were looking at, and we went through the same process, and everything was going well, and we wrapped the session up. It was a daily session. We wrapped the session up, and I checked in with our designers, and yeah, this is great insights, really, really good. Went home feeling, yeah, this is great, in a really, really good position. The next morning, I got a call from the client. And that person said, can you please come and see me in my office where they were located? So that was a car drive. I'm not feeling very comfortable where we are. And I wasn't expecting this at all. It was completely out of the blue. So I went down to see that person, and we had a conversation. And essentially, that person wasn't feeling comfortable with what we were doing with the visuals. For that person, it was a little bit superficial. It wasn't the usual planning and business strategy. So I did my best to reassure that person at the time. I really feel that we're on track. We've got some good insights. I'm going to skip forward to the first internal design meeting. Everybody was excited, and there was one route that it just jumped out as, oh my goodness, just like wow. Going to jump right the way forward to the very end. That design meant that particular brand we were working on saw the fastest ever growth in sales of any other brand in that whole category. And that was down to the amazing work of our designers to be able to connect with the audience, to be able to create something that stood out, but also resonated. And thanks to our colleagues in advertising, we created some films as well. Why am I sharing that slightly long-winded story with you? Is because in my experience, it would be absolutely delightful to think that the world in which we live is smooth and planned, and everything is aligned. And in my experience, that is just not the case. And quite often, what I found in situations where I've almost been pushed to the brink or to an emotional challenge, that's where I've dug in and people have dug in and actually brought forth surprises to ourselves of what we've been able to do, and also an amazing impact in this instance for our client. So I just wanted to share that with people right now to sort of try and sort of set the scene that, from my experience, whilst I've never experienced the pandemic before, thank goodness, but other types of rocky situations, I genuinely believe that from those types of situations, we can not just survive, but absolutely thrive by seizing the opportunity around the restriction or the constraints that are put in front of us. And my belief, through experience of seeing other people, is from that constriction, quite often people create, deliver stuff way beyond what they might have done before because of that constriction. I can talk on and on and on, and maybe I should just sort of draw a quick line there to allow Mike to say something and indeed get into the conversation, but just wanted to share that.
Thanks, DDF. It's nice to hear also sort of like, it sounds like there was like some sort of epiphanous moment with coming kind of originated by the designer on the team, or by the design part of the team. That's interesting to hear about.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna introduce Mike now. So Mike Calandra Cherde is joining us from his home in London. And Mike is a multidisciplinary designer focused on filmmaking and audiovisual languages. With a background in graphic design, sound design, and music. His practice is centered on music and cultural spaces emerging across communities of the African diaspora. And he's the founder of Crudo Volta, a visual collective documenting the development of contemporary lifestyles and music scenes of the African diaspora. Mike is also known to many of you as a lecturer on BA graphic communication design here at Central St. Martin's.
Hey, hi everybody. Right, okay, it's quite difficult to introduce myself. It's like I'm at home, but I will try to make it slightly interesting. So yes, I'm Mike, and I am a UAL graduate. Actually, I graduated in graphic design LCC in 2012, and I graduated like in a particular period. We are sort of like surfacing a conversation around like the self and the concept of reliance, and how these two elements they interact with each other. And that has been quite a crucial aspect of my practice in terms of, first of all, identify who I was as a designer, and then what my practice represented for me first, and then for my community, and how my community nurtured the intentions and the values and the morals and the larger scheme of my practice. Today I am the art director, and then I say the founder of this collective called Crudo Volta. But I started this, let's call it today, maybe a company, maybe a studio, a collective. I've started it on my own. I just graduated, and I was also in very particular circumstances. And what we do, just to be very quick, we try to understand what is happening on the African continent. I don't explore and navigate music as a sort of like entertaining device within communities, but I observe it and I study it as a sort of economy, and also as a prediction of an economy in the more financial and infrastructural sense of the term. Because through music, there is this capacity and ability to understand how communities interact with technology and information, and how they share technology and information, but also how they carry philosophical and aesthetic values through music. And being a graphic designer and being interested in visual, I mean, the impact of a visual, and also like semiotics and semantics and linguistics, I try to apply all those elements to my work. So across the last 5 years, we have traveled around 6 countries, the African continent, among which you have South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Mozambique. And we try to understand what does it mean to be young and to be African. And that was a question I asked myself when I graduated. What does it mean to be a young African designer? And I didn't know. And I say, instead of having answers from the jump, you should actually go on ground and try to understand what does it mean to be young and African, especially because we were in a sort of period where being the other or being Black, okay, disclaimer, I don't accept the term Black. It's a larger conversation, but just to facilitate this conversation, let's accept the term Black, because in my opinion, Blackness is a response to whiteness. And as Africans, we have more complex histories and we have complex heritage. So it's important to, first of all, explore them, understand them, and understand how they moved from an archaic stage to a more modern stage. And music can help to understand that, also predict where this is going. So I understand African diaspora and I explore African diaspora. That's what I do. And maybe the most popular format that we have had is the taxi. The taxi is a documentary format where we explore a particular scene through the experience of a taxi ride. Why a taxi ride? Because the taxi puts you in the liminal space where you are not really in the scene, but at the same time, you are there, right? You have these windows separating you from your own space and the community that you are exploring. And also you have this kind of touristy approach to your exploration of the environment that you are interested into. And another aspect that informed the practice was the fact that the music was transitioning from this sort of like a physical and tangible experience, where you have the scene, and within the scene, we know that, historically, you were able to not only participate in the music as a sort of like entertaining, sort of like ritual, but also like a transmit physically through contact certain aspect of the culture. And that wasn't feasible because of the digitalization of the music. So I started reasoning. So once you remove, let's say, the physical copy or the physical experience of music, what's the experience of music? How much do you understand out of a song? And you transform a song from a product to an experience. And that's what we've been doing in the last year. In the last years, we have documentaries. We organize also events, because we're really careful about the importance of IRL events and what role they have in terms of community building, because the sort of like a platform or collective, whatever we want to call it, is a way to also create a sense of first of all, advocacy and agency within our communities, but also the formation of a sort of public sphere in the diaspora, where we understand who we are and what we are becoming, and understanding it through the values that sort of like perpetrated through music. Now it's impossible to explain what music means for our community just in 20 minutes, but it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal across centuries and across the region. And we try to understand it, and we try to talk to each other and nurture the sense of continuity and make sense of what does it mean to be young and African in contemporary days.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to, I just want to say something before we jump into the discussion, which is that during preparation for this event, some really valid questions came up about the relevance of Emerson, and Jessica addressed that a little bit in the video earlier, but the relevance of Emerson, an overconfident 19th century white man, to now. And this is something that we might consider through discussion or not, because the discussion doesn't have to be confined to that at all. It's just a springboard. But I thought it would be useful to just read this short extract from the end of the introduction to just create more context, because I actually agree with Jessica that there is something fundamentally radical about Emerson's perspective that's missing but needed in today's discourse about the pandemic, about race and social justice and the environment. But I think that's arguable. So I'm just going to read this bit from the end of the introduction. When so much of what you've been groomed to rely upon vanishes from view, where do you go? Enter Emerson. To talk of reliance is a poor external way of speaking, he wrote. Speak rather of that which relies because it works and is. Now, switching back to Jessica's voice here. This is the essence of Emerson's seminal essay on self-reliance, originally published in 1841 and reproduced here in this book in its entirety. A cursory glance may grate on the sensitive reader. This is, after all, the writing of a supremely confident man whose language reflects the privilege and purview of a different era. American, Caucasian, schooled in the liturgical. Emerson made his living as a lecturer, and his authoritative tone can read as discomfiting, even didactic. But a closer read reveals something far more meaningful and relevant. This is a meditation on what it means to be human, what it means to have an imagination and to use it. So there's something in here about the imagination being important to understand as individual that I wanted to highlight. And so I think that is going to take me into my first question. And just as a reminder, let's go into the first question. So riffing off this idea about the imagination being important to understand as an individual, and actually also Jessica's comment during the video earlier that she was interested in Emerson because of his contention that consensus is actually evil. She used that word evil, which is it's a complicated one to unpack. My first question for everybody is, what is the relationship between thinking and being creative for yourself and working together? It's a hard question. Is there anyone who wants to start? I'm looking at Gemma. if it's okay.
Yeah, sure. I have to keep starting. No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. I also agree. I think it's super important to be able to think for yourself. I quite like in the essay as well, there's a part about like always like people not kind of holding you to your word in a way, like always being able to like question and change your opinion. And I also really liked that in like, I feel like in kind of like modern era where everything has like a kind of digital archive that's kept forever, like it's quite refreshing to be like, no, like you can, you know, recognize that maybe you're wrong and change and, you know, adapt over time. I think my like kind of initial reactions in terms of, you know, this relationship of like thinking for yourself and working together, like just coming from a kind of cooperative perspective, is I really think that although it's important to have your own ideas, like it's also important to recognize that a lot of your ideas are kind of from relationships to other people. Like I never kind of think that much, like also when I'm designing like the work that I do, I don't really see it as like, oh, I sit in my like white box and am struck by inspiration. I kind of like really recognize that like I'm a product of like my environment and my upbringing and my privilege and family and friends and like books and teachers and everything. And I think that these things kind of like cross-pollinate and mix together in a way that's really interesting. And the kind of the ideas that emerge from that are like, you know, sometimes unexpected and definitely unique to me because it's kind of unique to my experiences, but also like I want to recognize that there's so much that is like created with other people as well.
Yeah. That's really nice and interesting. DDF, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I from my experience, again, the word consensus sort of resonates with a term that we use, and that's designed by committee. And I'm not. I don't like the word consensus, to be honest with you, but I'm a great believer in cooperation, and I'm a great believer in collaboration. And if you know, from a psychological perspective, I think the important thing that I'd like to share is that fundamentally our brains are wired to be social, to connect, and that's really, really important. And certainly from my experience throughout this pandemic, whilst we've got these great screens and it's great, I've missed the spontaneity of not necessarily speaking to people, but just wandering into a coffee shop on the way to a train station, past people, and almost sort of feeling that physical vibe. That's another story that we might get into, or maybe not later on. So for me, that's really, really important. But that relates to working in organizations, or certainly the organizations that I've worked in. There is absolutely a need to come together, not at the lowest common denominator, but at this level of, and I'm really envious of the fact that Gemma, you're working in a cooperative, because I really sort of love what that is all about, and the sense of that. So for me, yes, there is that need to interact, and I totally agree. A lot of our ideas arise because of these interactions and what we've been exposed to, whether that's recently or a long time ago. But at the same time, I would argue through those interactions, what for me is perhaps most important are two things. Self-understanding. Do I understand myself? And then self-belief. and that real sense of not letting go of that self-belief, even though in a working environment, we might not be able to be in a position to express that or present it in its fullest beauty. So my view is, yes, sort of thinking for ourselves in terms of understanding ourselves and believing in ourselves, absolutely key. Bringing that into the working situation, but recognizing that actually we might not be able to manifest that fully. And lots of examples of varying degrees of doing that.
Yeah, there might be something about the relationship, like that, kind of relating everything that's been said so far, being confident in your ability to think for yourself also allows you to change, allows you to it's what allows you to change yourself over time.
Yes.
And change your ideas over time. So just as a reminder to everyone, so we're monitoring YouTube for any questions that you would like to ask. So if you need to be logged into YouTube to ask them, but we'll do our best to incorporate them into the discussion as they come through. Mike, do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. Yeah, I will join DDF sort of like remarks, and in my opinion, like definitely self-belief. And but I mean, those elements of a self-belief, a self-confidence are made possible only through self-acceptance, right? And self-acceptance needs time, right? Time plays a huge role, and there is the element of self-love as well, because self-acceptance becomes possible only when there is a self-love, when there's this capacity to know who you are through an acceptance of who you are. And in my personal practice, it became pivotal, because that's one of the key elements. Now, reflecting on Emerson remarks from also a completely different context, because we also need to actually contextualize certain ideas based on the information that some people had in those times. We're talking about like the 19th century, right? And we are here with the baggage of the 21st century. It's easy to make some remarks and make some criticism. Looking two centuries behind. When I was graduating, there was a sort of like automaticity to my practice. Okay, I will end up in a design studio, and thinking as an individual, it was an automatic choice rather than privilege. I see as an automaticity. So in terms of engaging with the self-acceptance and self-love and self-questioning as well, you put yourself as a practitioner in kind of like having sort of like ethical and moral choices in order to understand where do you fit, not just as a practitioner, but as a person. So I started really becoming aware of my immigrant status, because I was immigrant twice. I'm an immigrant in it because I grew up in Italy, right? I was born in Africa. I lived my first 10 years in Africa, in Republic of Benin, but I've been an immigrant for 17 years in Italy. And I've been an immigrant here as well, right? But I became sort of ingrained this sort of automaticity. Okay, now you do this, and what if you don't do it, or why are you doing it, right? And also I started acknowledging the fact that I was becoming a practitioner from a marginalized standpoint, right? So what does that even mean economically? What does that mean? And that's where the question of being young and being African came into play. So what does it even mean, right? And I'm aware of my class, because I mean, we have this very sort of like monolithic description of a blackness that we don't acknowledge that there are some very important nuances. I come from a middle-class background. I come from a middle-class education. I come from a middle-class families. So I don't relate to many issues, and I don't jump on the train on many issues that are faced by the African lumpen proletariat, for example, right? And that puts me also in a position of relationship in my practice, or not relationship, of responsibility in my practice. Why do? You represent a voice, you have a responsibility, but also at the same time, you belong to a community. So the elements of individuality, which is very thorny when it comes to African context, because we have to acknowledge that the African continent at the moment is living across two different timelines. We have an Africanness that exists in the 21st century, but economically, Africa is still in the 19th century. right? Because we haven't had any industrial revolution yet. So we don't have the formation of a working class. And that puts, professionals like me, they've been able to live fully they practice in the 21st century in a very complicated position, especially when they go back to their countries and they interact with the economies of their countries. Right. So there are some philosophical standpoints. I guess me and you, Rebecca, we had this conversation quickly about capitalism and Marxism, right? And I would suggest to everybody, if you have the chance, to read some African materialists, right? Because we never refer to African philosophy. People like Stanislas Adotebi, he has this beautiful book that's called Negrologue and Negritude. So it's a critique to Senghor, for example. And Senghor was advocating for this more metaphysical, representation of African aesthetics and African thought. But Stanislas Adotebi was more concerned in the formation of an African economy, and how that's made possible only through a materialist sort of approach to philosophy, where we don't really observe this sort of like idealized idea of being African and social African and continuing African, because we are not yet in the process of forming our economies. And how do we do that? And individuality is needed, but individuality needs to be mitigated at the same time. So all these elements are not automatic. They always put me in a very difficult position. I really don't know whether individuality is useful and fruitful, but at the same time, I don't know if always nurturing the sort of like collective idea is useful neither, in terms of engaging the process of that dialectical process that created like an independent economy that was made possible in the 19th century in Europe, right? Because that's where we are on our continent. It's difficult to do that. So all these automatic choices, they make it difficult. The way I've solved the problem is forming a team mainly of Black practitioners, where my voice is not left alone, and I don't represent as a own a very complex territory. Right, and the approach that we have used as a collective, we have representatives from different areas of the continent. So we have the Caribbean, we have South Africa, we have East Africa. I represent West Africa, for example. We have other West Africans. So we have different problems, we have different history, different heritages, and different economies, and we try to understand that. So to respond to the to close to the idea of individualism and individuality, yes, it's important, but it's dangerous. The collective thought, yes, it's important. Yes, it is dangerous. And it's about choices. It's about situations. And the critical thinking comes into play. The context justify the position and justify the thought.
That's amazing, Mike. Thank you. Actually, what you're saying relates to a question that's come in from Libby Higgins, one of our students. So, and it kind of relates to the fact that I think what a lot of you are circling around right now is something to do with figuring out how to be ethical and authentic, and the relationship between individualism and like trying to be ethical and authentic. If those words are kind of they're related words, I think. And Libby asks, from the words of Emerson, how can graduate designers unite a desire for individualism and personal responsibility in their practice with the practical need for employment? And I guess that extends to just, all the, being able to like survive in life and pay the bills and eat and have a kind of rich life. And I mean rich in the wider sense, not in just like pound signs. But like, what is that? I guess, I guess this is, I think this is a difficult balance, and I wonder if anybody wanted to comment on that.
I'm happy to chip in with a perspective to begin with. First of all, I think, Mike, when you use the word situations, I love the idea of self-acceptance and self-love. I'll say that right up front. Absolutely key. Totally endorse that. And when you mentioned later on situations, I feel that is very, very important from experience. That there have been some elements in my career where I haven't been comfortable let's say, in that particular situation, furthering my career, what I wanted to do, but it allowed me to survive. And that's happened a couple of times. And that's where, for me, the situational context comes in. And again, from my experience, rather than it being a fact, what I've learned is in those situations where let's say we're taking on a role or a job or some piece of work that has, let's say, a more materialistic purpose. For me, that's when self-belief and self-understanding really comes to the fore, and not losing that. And from my experience, that those situations have passed and put me back on a trajectory of my career, for want of a better term, or come back to focus more on being able to express myself. So as a starting point, I would say, again, from my experience, not all situations that I found myself in have been perfectly aligned to what I've wanted to do, but by keeping really tight in my mind on what I want to do and what I believe has allowed me to sort of transcend that interim
Discomfort.
Yeah. And succeed through. And I would say to everybody, you may find that in your career over the next 10 to 20 years, and again, from experience, hold on to what you're about, what you really believe in, what your passions are, what your skills are, and just see that as a transient moment that might be necessary.
And I actually think that there's something, you're saying discomfort, and actually, I think that there's been a lot of discomfort felt by different kinds of discomfort, felt by everybody. I mean, everybody's had a different experience of this pandemic, and some much more tragic than others, but everybody's had discomfort. I think that's something that we're sharing. And I actually think that having discomfort during your education is actually really positive and feeds into education in a positive way, because it's almost what creates change and learning in education. So I guess it leads me to the question of whether there are any unique skills or other attributes that you all think that design students graduating now, such as maybe being more comfortable with uncertainty and discomfort than prior generations of grads. Are there any other unique skills or attributes that you see students graduating now, having gone through what we've all been going through, what they now bring into the professional world? Anyone? I'm looking at Gemma.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, as you say, like being okay with discomfort is a big one. I think adaptability, really being able to kind of respond to things as they change. And I mean, I think also like the pandemic and the situation or whatever that it's caused is a crisis, but I think also like acceptance that, you know, there's not going to be like a kind of after the pandemic. And to be honest, like before the pandemic, we were also in crisis. Yeah. So it's just like the ongoingness of it rather than this like resistance to this being like a unique situation or something like that. Like for myself personally, I graduated in 2009 and it was, you know, just after the recession. It was like a really bad time to graduate as well. So I know that it can be like terrifying, but, you know, people find ways to adapt and to innovate and like yeah, things might not like, fit with your perfect plan. But I really agree with what DDF was saying before, and Mike as well, actually, in terms of like, really working out what your values are, and not taking like the kind of automatic path, but like, if you have an idea of like what success means to you, which might not be like working for like some flashy studio or whatever, and you have an idea of like your purpose and your values and like your context and skills and everything, and then you can kind of like, if you have this vague plan, you can kind of adapt and change and be flexible as you go. Yeah.
We had a question come in, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly. I'm not sure who the question came from, but I think, so I'll sort of translate it. The question was about being business owners in very different ways and like the unique perspectives it gives you. And I think I want to reframe that to sort of what perspective does having initiated your own way of practicing give you on, in other words, there's three really different kinds of initiative here. And I think the question is, what does that teach you about yourself to initiate something?
I can start.
Yeah, please. Thanks.
Well, I mean, one of the critical elements of my work is risk. I from the start, I've been forced to invest in what I do, like financially. And I've been forced to sort of like reframe a conversation that's usually approached in a certain way, like a black music as a sort of like entertainment of pop culture, kind of like entertaining aspect of pop culture.
Sure.
And this for example, this is something that I own maybe to UAL, because I've been able to reframe my practice in an academic framework. I never thought that I would find so much continuity between pop culture and academia. And I'm in this journey trying to find the continuity between the two worlds, which makes it very interesting, bringing a pop culture into the classroom, for example, and try to approach a larger and more complicated conversation with the students through the use of pop culture. I remember like watching like a Zizek videos when I was a student. He was using The Wire as a sort of like examples to talk about like a more complex stuff. And I always found it very fascinating. And another element that I'm very interested into is the spiritual aspect of taking risks, the spiritual aspect of initiating something. And I would never have thought that I would cite Jordan Peterson, but yes, I'm about to cite Jordan Peterson, because he was referring to the hero myth. I think I was watching something like, there are two very, I don't know, like I was watching a random video YouTube the other day, Jordan Peterson having a conversation with Brandon Russell. it was surreal, but they made a very interesting conversation about the archetype of the hero. And I think in entrepreneurship and in risk, this is the element of initiating and going against odds, right? And the sort of like hero myth, like kind of Homeric myth of the hero. So where you have to go and make mistakes and come back with results of these mistakes. And those mistakes, they are not just practical, they're also spirituals. And that's where you get your morals and your values. I will never do that again. I will never sit down at tables with those kind of people. I will never invest my time again. And you do that only by taking risks and engaging with center conversations. So I think it teaches you, first of all, what is ownership, right? It teaches you not ownership just of your property, ownership of yourself. We can observe what's happening. It seems like a very trivial conversation, but what's happening today in football is deeper than football, right? It's really a transition from human experience to human products, right? And that's what the conversation is really about. And we have like the general public. It's the same in music as well. They are having like one experience that usually was used to create a sense of belonging, continuity, human fantasy, human imagination. They're being contended by two poles. They really don't, both angles, both poles really don't care about everyday people. They don't. They want to sell more jersey, and they want to have ownership of broadcasting. That's where the conversation is about now. So as an entrepreneur, or as a sort of like advocate of independent ownership, owning your capital, communities that own capital, that invest in their capital, it's important. And also going through the process, the spiritual process of owning your capital, coming from a colonized background, right? From a subordinated, marginalized background, I understand the ownership of your resources, investing in your resources, taking risk with your resources, accessing to information and technology to make the better use of your resources. So for me, it's important. It's important to make mistakes, and that's what we teach in practice to our students as well. Make mistakes, because it's an iterative process. You will make mistakes. You will lose money. You will lose friends. You will lose time. You will seriously do. You're about to graduate, and you enter a market. You will lose yourself. You even understand, why am I doing this? And going back to the elements that we mentioned so far, values, self-acceptance, self-love, self-understanding, you will get through those stages where you're understanding why you need ownership of your products, ownership of yourself, ownership of your resources, and ownership of your education. First and foremost, knowledge is not given, but knowledge is taken. You take it.
That's really interesting. Actually, there's some stuff in some of the essays in this book. There's some stuff about getting lost and the value of failure, and how that important that is to kind of uncovering who you are and understanding, grounding who you are.
Just to close up, I didn't finish the
sorry.
The Jordan Peterson thing, because I was thinking, what's the use of being a hero or being on that Homeric journey where you sail in your journey if you can't come back with what you have learned?
Yeah.
So it's good to go outside and learn something and come back to your community, and that's where you have that sort of like tension between being an individual and being within a community. You need to come back. Ulysses come back home at the end of the book. Yeah. So
I think adding to that, Mike, if I may, totally agree. And especially this notion of ownership of self and taking risk, and absolutely the spiritual aspect of that, of learning. But for me, there's another aspect, and that is, certainly I found it extremely painful. And I've heard other people say the same, that it's easy, let's say, for us to say this with hindsight, where we are and our experiences. For me, it has been painful, that sort of ownership of self and risk and things not working out and learning from that. And that brings me back to, I think you mentioned, Gemma, the sort of adaptability and resilience. And for me, this resilience is so important that we build self-resilient. And I'm not going to go off on a track, but happy to share perspectives on another occasion or something. But this notion of maximizing our resilience so that we can put ourselves in these situations where we're taking risk. And if that doesn't quite work out, that we can come out of it with less pain, let's say. And again, I'm speaking from experience. I'm not trying to preach here. From my experience, by boosting our resilience, we can come out of that with slight less pain and of course, learn from it. And that for me has only, well, it's been exacerbated by this pandemic, to be honest with you. The importance of our resilience and our well-being and really fortifying our bodies and our minds and our spiritual being so that we can maximally cope with anything that's thrown at us and drive on through.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in as well? I just wanted to say, like, in terms of this, like, initiating your own thing and owning your own thing, that for me, it's been like an incredibly empowering, like, just, I don't know, the best decision I made kind of thing. So sorry also if that's too preachy. But I really liked that, just how, like, it's a lot of responsibility and kind of accountability, especially when you're working with other people, but also like, because there's so much space, rather than being kind of defined to like, okay, this is your role, you're a graphic designer or whatever. Like there's just so much room to, yeah, be creative, make mistakes, grow, etc. And I really like also how Mike was saying this idea of like iteration. That's like a really core part, I think, of how we work, like not just how we design, but also like we're constantly iterating on like how the co-op, yeah, how we work with other people, how we work with each other. We have these like continuous like cycles, you know, like every week pretty much, of like retrospecting, like looking internally, reflecting like on things that, yeah, like were painful or like, you know, upset us or were stressful, etc. But like through that process, like by reflecting, you can kind of like, yeah, change rather than doing the same thing. And yeah, I guess I really enjoy being able to kind of put those structures and like uphold them, etc. And being able to shape that element of work as well. Yeah,
that's great. So this question, the next question I want to ask is more sort of looking at the horizon, I guess, a little bit. So the question is, what kinds of new opportunities do you see for upcoming graduates as a result of convergences of spaces that had been separate? Mike sort of mentioned before entertainment and academia, or pop culture and academia, but work and home, entertainment and academia, and also different geographic locations. I don't know if Mike wants to jump in on that one first.
Well, okay. Can you reframe the question, because I was trying to understand.
Sorry. Yeah, the question is, what kinds of thinking about the future from where we stand now,
right?
What kinds of opportunities do you see coming as a result of convergences of spaces that had been separate? So work and home are kind of convergent recently, entertainment and study.
All right, okay.
Graphic geographic environments kind of collapsing with the internet at times in various ways.
Okay, I've been thinking about this one. Okay, because it separates because of course this pandemic, I was working from home, and like in both of my sort of direction, like teaching and practicing from home. So like I had different lessons according to the two professions. So in terms of my practice as a graphic designer, as a multidisciplinary designer, whatever that is, I think yes, this continuity between pop culture and more complex stuff, I've been very interested into it because of the bar of conversations. For some reason, we have been some conversations that usually were belonging and pertaining to certain environments, they became mainstream somehow, and not everybody had actually the tools and the skills to process what was happening, right? And it was always a sort of like delivered in a very pop mainstream format, right? You might not know much about representation and watch, I don't know, George Floyd funeral on BBC at 7 p.m. while you're having dinner, and you don't really know what's happening, but you need to know what's happening, right? And you need reading skills to understand how you are being treated and how information is being sort of like formatted to make you participate in conversation in a way that maybe you are not able to participate. So I found that very interesting, and I started reflecting on how that can be done also on an independent level, and what are the risks, what are the responsibilities, and how as designers we can start participating in this process of sort of like raising the threshold of participation and engagement with the complex subjects, right? And being providers of also facilitators of messages and information, and being constantly engaged with information systems, it becomes quite interesting for us to understand where our practice is going, right? And how we can engage on different levels with what we do. So I was interested with that. So in a sense, I became interested in this bastardization of academia, I think people like Stuart Hall, for example, they really started doing that kind of stuff in the 80s and so on. It's very interesting. Edward Said, I would say, is somebody that was already doing that in decolonization, for example, and many other practitioners. So I'm interested in that aspect. I'm also interested in how I have rearranged the continuity between my practice and my teaching. I always seen sort of like my teaching as a sort of like a back end of my practice, where my research somehow and my relationship with my students, we kind of inform my practice and the way my practice evolves. But these pandemics has reversed. So my practice became very experimental in order to bring in the classroom something completely new. So my practice became the back end of the front end, which is my teaching. So I'm experimenting a lot with the broadcasting, influencer culture, because that's my daughter, she's 13 and she knows more about gender equity and equality than me, through TikTok. And I'm trying to understand how, I'm really trying to understand how, and I'm trying to understand why is it so easy, and why those tools, they are being demonized all the time. They are also sources of information, and how in our practice we can engage rather than seeing them as the devils, trying to understand how they work and how we can engage with it. And I start thinking about like a crisis. We're thinking about like health issues, and we think about racism. We're thinking about environmental issues. We're thinking about sexuality. We think about all these issues that are urgent right now, and need to be addressed right now, and how we can do that through those instruments that are being made available. And of course, Rebecca, you mentioned geography. Geography for me, as you know, is the bulk of my work, and I've been produced like two projects between Ghana and the UK from my desktop. And I'm really interested into that. I'm really interested by the apparent, because it's
yes and no.
Yes and no, and no. So we are in this sort of like a beta stage of the sort of like erasure of boundaries, right? But at the same time, we still have some technical issues like the political, the financial, the fiscal, and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But I'm really interested in the dissolution of boundaries, geographical boundaries, the dissolution of perceived territories. Silicon Valley is already engaging with it, right? We have like a Facebook. Well, I mean, Twitter just opened their headquarters in Ghana this week, right? So they're already transcending these ideas of boundaries.
So, Mike, do you mind if I just say, thinking about our graduates, do you see any particular, what would you suggest them to consider in relation to this changing landscape?
Because of the ease, first of all, because of the easiness of reach, they don't have necessarily to travel to engage with existing businesses and provide the services. But as I said, we have issues such as the fiscal problems and the political problems and so on. So they need to engage with that. I can't give all information now, but there are processes, there are procedures that they can engage with. So they can engage outside. Also, as I was saying, in Africa, we have two timelines now. We have the 21st century and 19th century going on at the same time. So you have a younger demographic that is in the 21st century. So they are able to engage with you at your same level, even better. I would say that now in Nigeria, in Lagos, so you have some creative firms. They are on the same level as here in London, all right? But now the issue is how you capitalize from a country which hasn't even got a working class, where you have this huge divide between the upper middle class and the lumpen proletariat, right? So you don't have a sustainable economy. So you might be able to create a product for a certain class, like a very, very tiny class, but then on a macro level within the region, it becomes very difficult. So the process is very frustrating, especially if we start thinking in a sort of iterative sort of like a framework of the work. Where do we restart? You don't have the critical mass to do that. Right, in Europe, we can do that. We can restart project. We can reshape our project. We can rethink the way we design, because the demographics allow us to work in that way. So students, they can't always work in that way in those countries. So they need to not only work with those countries, but at the same time, enter the economy of those countries, not financially. I mean, the economy in terms of the resources and how the infrastructure of those countries, and help. right? So
Mhm.
also reimagine their position, not only as providers of messages, but also facilitators of infrastructures and facilitators of markets and economies and so on and so on. And it can be like just something simple like creating a campaign for a fashion capsule, right? I'm not thinking about complex stuff like info data or so on. I'm thinking even like something very basic, like creating a capsule, a fashion capsule. You need to understand all those aspects. So this is possible, also because everything is sort of like interfaced by the web and by social media, and because of pop cultures and so on. So there are possibilities. I'm really interested into that. And to close, I'm really interested now in teaching, of course. So how does that happen? Especially because especially when it comes to our institutions here in the UK, I've seen sort of interest with countries like India and China and South America to some extent. I don't see any particular interest in the African continent, in West African region, for example. And the dissolution of those sort of like geographical barriers, they might help, right, to start a process where a demographic that is systematically denied access to information and technology through the release of visas and so on, they can finally take ownership that we were referring earlier to their own infrastructure and markets and societies. And I understand from this point of view here in Europe, people are so, oh no, it's getting digital. Oh my God. But if you think about Africa, for example, like West Africa, for example, they need it. I
think if I were going to like sort of pull there was a lot in what you said, but if I were going to pull like one point out of that might be useful to underline. I think it's really interesting to say that really thinking about the way and it relates to something Gemma said a lot earlier, and when she started about her interest in structures and actually like leading creativity through thinking about infrastructure is a really amazing space of opportunity right now, like starting with thinking about infrastructure and how infrastructure is changing. It's a really interesting, I don't think graphic designers talk about infrastructure that often, and I think we should be talking about infrastructure and infrastructuring more.
However, it's interesting that you say that. Just to join that, it's important to avoid mistakes of the past, right? Because that's what happened with the post-colonialism, right? Because you have this intention to create infrastructure without understanding.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
It's not possible without understanding the territory.
Very important. That's very important. Okay. Should I, Gemma, do you want to build on that at all, or kind of come back to the earlier question in any way? Or I guess we're kind of wrapping up now. So I'm wondering if there's anything you want to revisit, really.
Yeah, not for me.
No, okay. How about DDF?
Yeah, and I was interested in the notion of dissolution of boundaries. What I've experienced, both with colleagues and clients, is an acceptance of one another as people, having a work life and a social family life, as opposed to people who just work from an office. And so I feel that there are two aspects to this notion of dissolution of boundaries, which I think I'd like to think arise to two areas of opportunity. First of all, the geographical boundary. Right now on our team, we have people who live in Sydney and in Cape Town, and they interface very, very well, actually, if not better, because they're working in different time zones. So the first thing for me is I really hope that our students think that there are opportunities beyond the confines right now. And I would encourage everybody to really, dig into what you want to do right now, what you believe in, and look really, really far. And then the other aspect that I'm really interested in, and again, I suppose it's more of a hope than a prediction, but this notion of dissolution of the boundary that we put around ourselves as individuals when we leave our social structure and go into the working environment. And I believe that is actually really healthy, because it allows us as individuals to be more of ourselves than just playing out the roles. And again, this comes from experience, playing out the roles that we're expected to play in a particular environment. So for me, dissolution of the geographic boundary, but dissolution of, let's say, the social stereotype boundary associated with working in a particular physical environment and just presenting that aspect of one's individuality that relates to the work. I don't know whether that made sense, that last bit, but.
No, it does. And I guess I wonder if I feel like I'm still thinking about there's something I think in the word we Mike and I were both using the word infrastructure before, and I guess I want to make it clear that there's like it's a really like it doesn't just mean like I don't know, like pipes and stuff, you know. I wasn't just, there's something about the kind of paying attention to the, and I think this is DDF's kind of getting at this a bit, paying attention to the ways that our textures of daily life have been completely reconfigured, because actually like there's a way to use that experience that you're having of that total transmutation of the infrastructure of your life and all of the ways that your routines have changed and been reconfigured, and all the ways your experience of work and study have been reconfigured, and to really channel that your expertise on your immediate experience right now, wherever you are, into kind of, because all of those experiences are, I agree with Gemma, we're not going to have we're not going back. We're going to be in continual crisis, and all of those, all of your experiences of that are like valuable knowledge for you to bring to how you define your practice moving forward. And it's really, that should be a source of confidence, different kinds of confidence for each of you, I guess. Yes.
I think just on that, I think that there's lots of opportunity, like as stuff does start to reopen. Like we've obviously had this year where you're working from home, but you also can't go out and see anyone. But now we can have much more of this like balance and a much more full life, like DDF is saying. And yeah, I think there's real like opportunity to, like redefine our relationship to work, and also like make the most of that kind of flexibility. I think there's also the fact that like this distributed working, like it means that things are much more accessible to different, like a broader range of people, like not just in a geographical sense. And also just the amount of time, like especially, you know, coming from somewhere like London, you spend so much time like commuting and just like that kind of daily grind or whatever. And just, having that time back and then working out what you're going to do with it. And like, you know, rather than spending it going to the office every day, instead like spending time like, maybe building community where you are, or spending time with family, that kind of thing, I think is really great.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, so what I'd like to do is that was a really, a great, like kind of wide reaching discussion. And I think so many parts of it could continue at great length, but I'm going to move us to, I want to say thanks to all three of you. Thanks so much to Gemma and Mike and DDF. So before we finish, we have one other video that we'd like to play. And this presents an interesting invitation to our students and other students who might be joining from elsewhere. And it kind of follows on the discussion that we've been having in an interesting way. And it's about a new publishing platform from Thames Hudson. So Jacob, could you please cue that video?
Good afternoon. My name is Lucas Dietrich, and I'm here to tell you about Volume, a publishing platform for visual culture. What a lot of people don't realize is that publishing is a business-to-business trade. Publishers sell to booksellers, who sell their books to customers. Amazon is no different from a traditional bookseller, but it knows a lot more about our readers than we do. Publishers do need to rely on booksellers and other physical retailers, such as museum shops, to sell our books. But there are now real opportunities to connect directly with readers. We set up Volume as a way for visual creators to make books and to target them directly at their audiences. Social media and the rise of the superfan, not to mention the emotional connection people feel to the creation and physicality of the book, provide an exciting new spectrum of possibilities. Volume is largely based around a crowdfunding model, but it's a bit more interesting than that. I'd like to give you one example of how this works. We worked with a young man named Liam Wong, who was a graduate of an art school in Scotland, who found his way into the video game world via art direction, becoming one of the youngest art directors at Electronic Arts. But what he really wanted to do was explore his passion for photography and for Tokyo. In his free time, Liam walked the streets of Tokyo, usually after midnight, often in the rain, capturing the lights, the streets, the people. The result of this work and those endless hours of wandering the streets is a book called Tokyo, and this is the project that we decided to present on Volume. And this is where it gets interesting with Volume. In conventional publishing, there's usually only a single title, a single cover image, a single edition of the work. But at Volume, we can put the book at the center of a wide range of other offerings and even experiences. Amongst the offerings on Volume were a special edition which included a neon purple acrylic slipcase covering a cloth-bound book, and a poster of one of Liam's most popular images, which he signed. As you can see, Liam managed to find over 2,600 people that backed his book, his poster, and all of the editions of his work. This is just one example of what we can do on Volume, and we think you can do it too. But think about defining your perspective, building your audiences, understanding the nature of your audiences, and reflect on what your book would mean to other people. Most of all, good luck. And thank you for listening.
Okay, so just to be clear, Volume is an initiative of Thames Hudson, and they are very interested in ideas from current and graduating students for new projects, and they really want to help bring some of your ideas out into the world in a new way, and it's one platform where you might be interested in doing that. What we are going to do is circulate some further information about how you can get started if you're interested in next week's newsletter, and you can also have a look at their website, vol.co, if you'd be interested in getting a publishing project out through their platform. So I'm just going to wrap up now. I'd like to say thank you once again to Gemma, to Mike, and to DDF. I'd also like to say thank you so much to Jessica Helfand, Jarrett Fuller, and Betsy Vardell from Design Observer, and Augusta Pownall and Lucas Dietrich, and you heard Lucas's voice just now in the video we watched, from Thames and Hudson. And from the GCD admin team, I would like to thank Claire Hayes for helping us organize getting the books out to students, which we're going to be doing, like I said, over the next couple of weeks. The lights came back on now. I would also like to, this is the last event of the series, so I'd like to give a really big thank you again to Jacob Watmore and David Frame for their work on the entire series behind the scenes. And finally, I'd also like to give a shout out to Jake Smith and Billy Murabin for their work on the webpage for the series, which kind of goes back into last academic year. As a reminder, this event and all of the previous events in the series can be replayed in full on csmgcd.net/lectures. And I'll just say goodbye and thank you to everybody again.